The hushed reverence of the German High Command headquarters in the summer of 1940 was shattered not by a bombing raid but by a ripple of laughter. Imagine the scene: polished oak tables, maps meticulously charting their lightning conquests across Europe, the air thick with the scent of cigars and the heady aroma of victory. These were men who had redefined warfare, masterminding the Blitzkrieg, commanding the most sophisticated war machines the world had ever seen. They had crushed nations in weeks, in days. And then, German military intelligence laid out the photographs of America's latest military vehicle. A low collective chuckle began, quickly escalating into outright guffaws. The images showed something preposterous. 4 exposed wheels, a flat hood hammered seemingly from tin, an open frame offering absolutely no protection. One colonel, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye, jested that the Americans must be planning to deliver mail, not fight a war. Another, perhaps with a nostalgic nod to Germany's own equestrian traditions, suggested they'd be better off sticking to their horses. The room erupted. These strategists, these architects of mechanized fury, saw a child's toy. They saw a farm implement. They saw a testament to American naiveté. They dismissed the reports as irrelevant, a footnote to their grand, unfolding strategy, and moved on to what they considered more serious matters. None of them, not one single brilliant, battle-hardened mind in that room, could have possibly conceived the chilling reality that this peculiar little machine, this object of their ridicule, would soon appear in numbers so vast, so overwhelming, that it would literally haunt their retreat across 2 continents. They couldn't know that their laughter would become one of history's greatest, most profound, and ultimately, most fatal miscalculations. This isn't just a story about a vehicle, it's a story about the danger of arrogance, the deceptive power of simplicity, and the profound wisdom embedded in understanding what truly matters when everything is on the line. It's a tale that challenges our fundamental assumptions about progress, perfection, and power. To truly grasp the magnitude of this error, we need to picture the stark, almost theatrical contrast that defined 2 fundamentally opposing philosophies of war, and indeed, 2 different ways of seeing the world. On one side stood the undeniable pride of German engineering. Their panzers were not merely tanks. They were rolling cathedrals of steel, massive behemoths with armor thick enough to deflect artillery shells, their engines roaring with a guttural, mechanical fury as they crushed everything in their path. These were machines built to intimidate, to dominate through sheer presence, to embody the very concept of Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Their commanders, protected behind inches of meticulously crafted steel, surveyed the battlefield like modern-day knights, encased in their mechanized armor, untouchable, invincible. Consider the Tiger tank, a legend in its own right. Weighing a staggering 56 tons, its formidable 88mm gun was capable of obliterating any Allied armor at ranges exceeding a mile. The Panthers, the Panzer IVs, the self-propelled assault guns, each represented not just a piece of military hardware, but years of painstaking development, precision engineering pushed to its absolute limits, and almost artistic dedication to mechanical perfection. German tank crews trained for months, sometimes years, to master these complex machines. They memorized hundreds of procedures, learned to diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone, understood their vehicles as literal extensions of their own bodies, highly specialized, finely tuned, and incredibly effective under ideal conditions. This was a philosophy of war that prioritized individual excellence, exquisite design, and masterful execution. It was a belief that a few perfectly crafted instruments could overwhelm any quantity of lesser tools. On the other side, something that looked almost absurd, almost childlike in its contrast. American soldiers bounced along dirt roads in vehicles that genuinely looked like they'd been assembled in someone's garage on a Saturday afternoon. No armor, no doors, just 4 wheels, a remarkably simple engine, and seats that left the occupants utterly exposed to everything from the biting rain to enemy rifle fire. From the perspective of the German High Command, the contrast overwhelmingly favored them. How could these toy-like vehicles, these flimsy contraptions, possibly compete with the mechanical monsters of the Wehrmacht? It was like bringing a pocket knife to a sword fight, or a tricycle to a tank battle. The very idea was laughable. Even the British, their closest allies and already hardened veterans of the Desert War, shared this deep skepticism when the first American vehicles arrived at Liverpool docks in 1941. One sergeant major reportedly asked, half seriously, if the Americans had sent their actual vehicles by mistake, and these were just training toys. A British tank commander, a veteran who had seen his Matilda tanks, with their 4-inch thick armor, torn apart by German 88s, walked around one of the first arrivals, shaking his head in bewildered disbelief. The Americans expected to fight with something that rifle bullets could penetrate? It seemed like madness, a profound misunderstanding of the realities of modern mechanized warfare. Yet there was something subtly, profoundly different about how the Americans treated these machines, something that spoke to a deeper cultural and philosophical divergence. They didn't name them like tanks or assign them impersonal numbers like trucks. They gave them nicknames: Old Faithful, Desert Rat, Lucky Penny. They painted girlfriends' names, pin-up girls, and crude, often humorous slogans on the hoods. They treated them less like military equipment and more like companions, extensions of their own personalities, loyal partners in the chaos of war. To the battle-hardened, protocol-driven Europeans, this seemed almost childish, unprofessional, even dangerous. Where German crews maintained strict military protocol with their vehicles, always spotless, always by the book, Americans were seen sitting on hoods, eating lunch, using their vehicles as card tables for a quick game, or sleeping across the seats under the vast, indifferent sky. This casual familiarity struck European observers as deeply unprofessional, a glaring lack of discipline. How could you possibly fight a war, a brutal, unforgiving war, with such informality, such an almost domestic relationship with your combat equipment? It defied all conventional wisdom, all established military doctrine. It seemed like a recipe for disaster. But wars, as history constantly reminds us, are not always won by the biggest weapons, the most intricate designs, or the most stringent protocols. Sometimes they are won by the smartest ones. And intelligence, as the German High Command would learn at a terrible, existential cost, doesn't always come wrapped in armor or gleaming chrome. Sometimes, often in fact, it comes in the humble, unassuming form of radical simplicity. It comes from understanding that in war, as in nature, the most adaptable species survives, not necessarily the strongest, the fastest, or the most perfectly engineered. This isn't just a historical anecdote, it's a universal principle, one that echoes in boardrooms, design studios, and even our personal lives today. Sometimes, the most sophisticated answer is the one you subtract, not the one you add. The incredible story of this deceptively simple vehicle, which would eventually become known globally as the Jeep, began not in Detroit's massive, sprawling factories or on the pristine drawing boards of well-funded military contractors. It began in a desperate, almost farcical scramble, a race against time that seemed doomed from the very start. On July 11, 1940, as German forces celebrated their conquest of France, effectively declaring victory in Western Europe, the United States Army issued a set of specifications that read less like an engineering request and more like a wish list penned by someone who fundamentally misunderstood the laws of physics and the realities of automotive manufacturing. They wanted a reconnaissance vehicle that weighed less than 1,300 pounds, a truly feather-light requirement for any all-wheel drive vehicle. It had to carry 3 soldiers with all their equipment. It absolutely required 4-wheel drive, a system that added inherent complexity and weight. It needed a folding windshield, a seemingly minor detail that would prove crucial. And most unbelievably, it had to be capable of climbing grades that would challenge a mountain goat. We're talking about extremely steep, almost vertical ascents. Just how impossible were these requirements? Consider the weight, half a ton to carry 3 fully equipped soldiers, plus itself. How could something so light possess 4-wheel drive, a system typically reserved for heavier, more robust vehicles? The engineering paradoxes were evident to anyone with even a passing understanding of car design. But the timeline was even more absurd, pushing the boundaries of what was considered humanly possible. Companies were given a mere 11 days to submit their bids. 11 days! And then a staggering 75 days to deliver working prototypes. In the automotive industry, where the development of a new model typically took years, from concept to showroom, This was not just aggressive, it was utter madness, a project seemingly designed for failure. Most major manufacturers, the titans of American industry, looked at these requirements, shook their heads, and simply walked away. Ford, the pioneer of mass production, initially showed absolutely no interest. General Motors, a colossal industrial entity, flatly declined. Chrysler, another giant, passed on the opportunity. The big three of American automotive manufacturing, companies that had defined and dominated the industry for decades, wanted nothing to do with what seemed like an impossible, thankless, and likely unprofitable project. They saw the constraints as insurmountable obstacles, not as catalysts for innovation. Their sophisticated processes were geared for stability, not chaotic sprints. The challenge, therefore, fell to an unlikely trio of candidates, almost an underdog story in itself. First, Willys Overland, a company that had barely survived the crushing weight of the Great Depression, still reeling from near bankruptcy, operating with skeleton crews and aging equipment. Second, Ford, who, despite their initial reluctance, only joined the race after being personally lobbied and pressured by high-ranking government officials, entering the competition reluctantly and late. And strangest of all, the American Bantam Car Company of Butler, Pennsylvania. A firm so unbelievably small it employed fewer than 20 people and had primarily been making tiny British-designed cars that most Americans had never even heard of, let alone purchased. Bantam's entire operation, its entire manufacturing footprint, could have comfortably fit in one corner of Ford's sprawling River Rouge plant. They had no business, by any conventional metric, competing with automotive giants. Yet, desperation and patriotism often make for the strangest of bedfellows, forging alliances and inspiring efforts that defy logic. Bantam's chief engineer, a brilliant but understandably cynical man named Karl Probst, initially refused the project. He was owed a substantial amount of money by the struggling company and saw absolutely no point in taking on what appeared to be a guaranteed impossible task. The company couldn't even pay him for past work. How on earth could they finance the development and construction of a military prototype, especially one with such outlandish specifications and a ludicrous deadline? But a powerful combination of patriotic duty, an appeal to his deeply ingrained American spirit, and desperate persuasion from company officials eventually changed his mind. They begged, they appealed to his sense of service, reminding him that if America were to enter the escalating global war, vehicles like this could quite literally save American lives. This wasn't about profit for Bantam, it was about survival for a nation. So, working without pay, living on his meager savings and an abundance of sheer hope, Probst, driven by an almost superhuman determination, sketched the basic design for what would become one of the most iconic vehicles in history, not in weeks or months, but in just 2 relentless days. He worked around the clock, fueled by an endless supply of coffee and an unyielding will, drawing on years of practical experience to strip away everything unnecessary, every ounce of superfluous weight, every layer of complexity. What emerged from his drafting table was revolutionary precisely because of its radical simplicity. There was no unnecessary weight, no complex interlocking systems, just the absolute essentials, arranged with a brutal, almost elegant efficiency. Where others, the engineers of the Big Three, might have instinctively added features, components, or layers of armor, Probst subtracted. Where others would have complicated and optimized, he simplified. He streamlined. He distilled. The design process undertaken by Probst and Bantam revealed a fundamental, often overlooked truth about innovation. Sometimes the best, most elegant, and most effective solutions don't come from having unlimited resources or boundless budgets. They come from having severe, uncompromising constraints. Probst couldn't afford complexity, so he designed simplicity. He couldn't add weight, so he found strength in lightness, in the inherent robustness of a minimal, well-considered structure. Every single component had to rigorously justify its existence. Every system had to serve multiple purposes, pulling double or even triple duty. The engine, for instance, would be simple enough that an ordinary farm mechanic with basic tools and common sense could repair it in the field. The chassis would be strong enough to handle unimaginable abuse, yet light enough for 4 men to physically lift it over an obstacle. The body would be minimal, just enough to hold the essentials, an open canvas for customization and adaptation. This wasn't just engineering. It was engineering by subtraction, a philosophy that would prove more revolutionary and ultimately more impactful than any additive approach could ever have been. It was the epitome of functional design, where form relentlessly followed function, stripped bare of all pretense. When Bantam's prototype, the BRC-40, arrived at Camp Hullabird, Maryland, for testing on September 23, 1940, it had been built in an astonishing 49 days. Army officials, conditioned by years of military bureaucracy and the slow grind of traditional procurement, fully expected it to fail, and fail spectacularly. The testing committee was comprised of seasoned officers who had witnessed the best and, more often, the absolute worst of military equipment. They had watched heavily armored vehicles bog down helplessly in mud, seen complex machines fail from the most minor of problems, and witnessed sophisticated equipment become utterly useless when one highly specialized, unobtainable part broke. They approached Bantam's creation with a skepticism that bordered on outright dismissal. The vehicle looked even smaller in person than in the photographs, an almost comically undersized contraption. One officer reportedly muttered with a sneer that it looked like something his kids would play with on the lawn. But then the testing began, and the skepticism, the dismissal, the barely concealed ridicule, slowly, steadily, turned to absolute amazement. The little vehicle, against all expectations, against all logic, climbed hills that had stopped powerful motorcycles dead in their tracks. Its revolutionary four-wheel drive and lightweight construction allowed it to scramble up slopes like a mechanical mountain goat, defying gravity and expectation. It forded streams that had bogged down much larger, heavier trucks. Its high clearance and surprisingly sealed electrical system keeping it running through water that would have drowned other engines and stalled more complex systems. It bounced and skittered through obstacle courses with an agility that defied logic, its simple, robust suspension absorbing impacts that would have shattered far more complex and delicate systems. More incredibly, when the Army mechanics, adopting a mindset of deliberate sabotage, intentionally tried to break it, they found they could disassemble major components in minutes and rebuild them just as quickly. The engine, based on proven rather than cutting-edge civilian technology, ran reliably, hour after hour, under punishing conditions. When they finally did manage to break something, a testament to their determined abuse, replacement parts could often be fabricated right there in the camp workshop using rudimentary tools. It was maintainable in ways that no military vehicle had ever been before, a stark contrast to the finicky, specialist-dependent machines of European armies. This wasn't just a vehicle. It was a testament to robust, field-repairable design. Word of this astonishing performance spread through the testing ground like wildfire. Officers who weren't even involved in the official trials started showing up, drawn by the incredible stories, compelled to witness the marvel for themselves. Some, defying strict military protocol, reportedly took unauthorized test drives, though official records remained diplomatically silent on such breaches. One colonel was seen grinning like a schoolboy after bouncing the prototype across a field at speeds that would have utterly destroyed a conventional staff car. Another was overheard saying it reminded him of the Model T Ford he'd learned to drive on as a boy. Simple, reliable, and utterly unstoppable. The vehicle performed beyond all expectations, meeting or exceeding every single requirement the Army had set forth. It weighed slightly over the specified limit, but that excess was instantly forgiven, given its astonishing capabilities. It could indeed carry 3 soldiers with full equipment, though they'd be cramped. It could tow a quarter-ton trailer or even a light artillery piece. It could be equipped with a machine gun mount. It was everything the Army had asked for, and astonishingly, much, much more. But success, as it often does, brought its own unique set of complications. The Army absolutely loved Bantam's design, recognized its genius, but harbored serious doubts about the tiny company's ability to mass-produce the thousands, and eventually hundreds of thousands, of vehicles the nation would need if it entered the war. Bantam employed fewer people than a single shift at a major auto plant. Their factory was cramped, their equipment dated, their infrastructure minimal. How could they possibly produce the vast quantities of vehicles the Army would undoubtedly need for a global conflict? In a controversial decision, one that would echo through legal proceedings and claims of intellectual property theft for years, the Army, prioritizing national security and industrial capacity above all else, effectively handed Bantam's meticulously crafted blueprints, the distillation of Karl Probst's desperate two-day genius, to both Willys-Overland and Ford, asking them to build their own versions. The ethics were, to put it mildly, questionable at best. Bantam had invested everything, working without a guarantee of profit, driven by patriotism, and now their much larger, more established competitors would directly benefit from their innovation, their sacrifice. But war, in its brutal pragmatism, often has its own grim ethics. Production capacity, the ability to churn out equipment at an unprecedented scale, trumped fairness, individual justice, and intellectual property rights. By November 1940, just a few short months after Probst's frantic sketches, 3 different prototypes were undergoing trials. The Bantam BRC-40, improved from the original with a slightly more powerful engine and refined details. The Willys Quad, heavier than Bantam's, but boasting a more powerful engine they christened the Go Devil. And the Ford Pygmy, showcasing the manufacturing giant's unparalleled production expertise with better fit and finish, a glimpse of industrial might to come. Each company had made improvements, adding their own corporate DNA, but the basic concept, the fundamental architectural bones of the design, the size, the layout, the radical simplicity, the inherent robustness, all came from those 2 days of desperate, coffee-fueled sketching in Butler, Pennsylvania. It was Probst's brilliant vision, made manifest. The competition among these 3 companies revealed corporate America at both its best and its worst. Innovation was borrowed, copied, adapted, and improved upon. Competition was fierce, sometimes ruthless, but ultimately it served a greater existential purpose. The Willys version, while heavier, featured that more powerful 60-horsepower engine compared to Bantam's 45. Ford's prototype demonstrated superior production techniques, parts that fit together with a precision that spoke of decades of mass production expertise, ready for scaling. Bantam's remained the lightest and most agile, true to the original vision of engineering by subtraction. The Army's final decision, once again, revealed wartime pragmatism at its most brutal. Willys-Overland received the main contract, their bid of $738.74 per unit undercutting Bantam's price. Ford would share production to ensure adequate supply, their massive factories capable of producing vehicles in numbers Bantam couldn't even dream of. Bantam, the true innovator, the company whose design had started it all, received orders for just 2,675 vehicles before being shifted to building trailers. It was the cruelest irony, a gut-wrenching injustice for a small company that had poured its heart and soul into an impossible task. The innovator, the true genius, was pushed aside for the mass producer. Karl Probst watched as his groundbreaking design, his intellectual property, headed to other companies' factories, his innovation becoming their profit. It must have been a bitter pill to swallow. But he, like so many Americans of his generation, understood that defeating fascism, stopping the march of totalitarianism, and preserving the very idea of freedom mattered infinitely more than corporate fairness, individual credit, or even patent rights. The decision prioritized production capacity and national survival over justice, setting the stage for an unprecedented scale of manufacturing that would ultimately overwhelm the Axis powers. What mattered wasn't who got credit, but who could build the most, the fastest, and get it into the hands of the soldiers who needed it most. And in that cold, stark calculation, Bantam, despite its brilliant start, never stood a chance. The legacy of their innovation, however, would endure far beyond their direct manufacturing output. What made this peculiar vehicle so special wasn't immediately obvious. At first glance, even to trained engineers, it seemed to embody everything wrong with American military thinking, everything primitive and unsophisticated. Where German vehicles were hyper-specialized, each machine a finely tuned instrument for a specific purpose, this was generic, a blank slate. Where German machines were heavily engineered, built with meticulous precision, this was almost primitively simple, a utilitarian assemblage of common parts. The specifications, when examined on paper, seemed less like a list of strengths and more like a catalog of compromises. A 60-horsepower engine, when German equivalents boasted twice that. Quarter-inch steel panels, when German panzers measured their armor in inches. A weight of just over 2,160 pounds, when German Kübelwagens, a lighter vehicle, often weighed more and carried less. German engineers, when they eventually examined captured versions, were genuinely puzzled. Where was the sophisticated engineering they expected from American industry? Where were the complex interlocking systems, the optical sights, the advanced transmissions? This seemed like something from an earlier era, a regression rather than progress, a machine designed by necessity rather than by high-minded principle. They saw it through their lens of complex excellence, and thus they entirely missed its profound disruptive genius. But specifications on paper, as the Germans would discover, don't tell the whole story. The vehicle's true genius, its almost magical efficacy, only emerged in use in the brutal, unpredictable crucible of combat. That lightweight construction, which initially seemed like a glaring weakness, a vulnerability, meant that the vehicle could be lifted by 4 strong soldiers, carried across obstacles that would have stopped any tank, any truck, dead in its tracks. In Italy, where the terrain was often unforgiving and riddled with ancient stone walls, soldiers routinely lifted them over barriers that blocked all other vehicles. In the Pacific, amidst the dense, swampy jungles and treacherous waterways, they were carried across streams on improvised rafts, sometimes even floated across on inflated inner tubes. This wasn't a flaw, it was an emergent critical capability. It turned an apparent weakness into an operational strength. The exposed mechanicals, which looked so vulnerable, so unprofessional to the German eye, were in fact a testament to radical maintainability. They could be repaired with basic tools by anyone who had ever worked on a farm tractor or changed a tire. A study conducted during the war found that over 90% of all repairs could be completed in under an hour with a standard set of tools that fit in a small canvas pouch. This decentralized maintenance, this empowerment of the common soldier to keep his vehicle running, was utterly foreign to the German philosophy of specialized, centralized repair, and the simplicity that appeared crude, almost primitive. It meant that repairs could be improvised from almost anything. This wasn't about having a precision-machined spare part. It was about ingenuity. In the harsh, unforgiving expanse of North Africa, mechanics discovered they could keep vehicles running with parts scavenged from captured Italian equipment, turning enemy salvage into Allied advantage. In the Pacific, when petroleum supplies ran dangerously low in isolated outposts, these remarkable machines continued operating on coconut oil, a testament to their unfussy, adaptable engines. In the brutal sub-zero conditions of the Russian front, where they were supplied under Lend-Lease, they continued operating in temperatures that froze the lubricants in German vehicles solid, their simple designs proving robust against the elements. This was a philosophy that embraced the chaos of war, not one that assumed the laboratory conditions of a testing range. This design philosophy, born of desperation and practical constraints, represented a fundamental break from European, particularly German, thinking. German vehicles were engineering showcases, each component precisely machined, each system meticulously optimized for its specific intended function. They were, without a doubt, magnificent machines when everything worked perfectly, under ideal conditions, with skilled operators and ample support. But war, as the ultimate test of any system, is the enemy of perfection. In the brutal reality of combat, dust clogs precise mechanisms. Mud fouls carefully calibrated systems. Battle damage disables sophisticated, irreplaceable components. Extreme cold freezes tight tolerances, causing brittle parts to crack. Scorching heat warps precision parts, leading to catastrophic failure. German engineering, in its pursuit of perfection, inadvertently created systems that were inherently fragile in the face of chaos. The American vehicle, by contrast, assumed imperfection. It assumed abuse, neglect, improvised maintenance, and operators who were not highly trained specialists but average soldiers. It was designed not for what should happen in an ideal world, but for what would happen in the grim reality of combat. Every component was overbuilt, underrated, and easily accessible. The engine, derived from robust civilian designs, used technology proven over millions of miles in everyday American cars and trucks. The transmission was agricultural in its simplicity and durability. The electrical system was basic enough that a farmer, with a rudimentary understanding of circuits, could understand and repair it. This wasn't about elegance, it was about enduring resilience. Further testing, even after initial deployment, continued to reveal capabilities that surprised even the designers themselves. The vehicle could ford 30 inches of water without stalling, its electrical system surprisingly waterproofed in ways that more complex German vehicles couldn't match. It could climb astonishing 60-degree grades, slopes that would challenge even trained mountain infantry, its low gear ratios and lightweight construction combining to provide that mountain goat agility. With special modifications, often improvised in the field, it could run on railroad tracks, steel wheels replacing rubber in mere hours, transforming it into a mobile rail car. Fitted with snow chains, it could traverse terrain that stopped even tracked vehicles, its lightweight preventing it from sinking where heavier equipment bogged down in snow or mud. One test report noted with amazement that it could be driven up a flight of stairs. Another found it could survive a drop of 6 feet without significant damage. These weren't design goals. They were discovered capabilities, emergent properties of radical simplicity and robust construction, capabilities born not of specific intent, but of generalist design. But perhaps most importantly, and this was the critical factor the Germans utterly failed to grasp, it could be everywhere. That modest engine meant fuel consumption half that of comparable vehicles, a crucial advantage in a war of logistics. Where a German Kübelwagen might get 20 miles per gallon, the American vehicle achieved 35 or more. The lightweight design meant that 4 vehicles could be shipped in the space required for just one truck, dramatically increasing transport efficiency across vast oceans. The basic construction meant that factories, once retooled, could build them faster than any military vehicle in history. Where German vehicles often required specialized transport and precise handling, these could be partially disassembled and stacked like furniture, maximizing precious cargo space on Liberty ships. Where German vehicles required trained, specialist crews, these could be driven by anyone who'd operated a car, accelerating training and deployment. Where German vehicles demanded specialized maintenance facilities and a complex supply chain of unique parts, these needed only basic tools, common sense, and readily available components. The Germans, steeped in their philosophy of specialization, still didn't understand. When intelligence reports described American troops modifying these vehicles for every conceivable purpose, from mobile offices to gun platforms, from ambulances to ad hoc bridges, they dismissed it as desperation, a sign of America's industrial weakness and lack of proper military planning. Surely a properly designed professional military force would have specialized vehicles for each specific role, wouldn't it? They couldn't grasp that versatility itself could be a weapon, that the ability to adapt and improvise on the fly with minimal resources was a profound strategic advantage. In their relentless, almost dogmatic pursuit of engineering perfection, they had forgotten one of warfare's oldest lessons. The perfect is often the enemy of the good enough. They had built vehicles for the war they wanted to fight, precise, controlled, professional, predictable. Americans, with their pragmatic simplicity, had built vehicles for the war that would actually be fought, chaotic, improvised, and utterly unpredictable. One philosophy would produce engineering marvels, the other would produce victory. American industrial might, that sleeping giant, had been dormant, almost inert, through the long, lean years of the 1930s. The Great Depression had shuttered factories, idled millions of workers, and reduced the mighty American industrial machine to a mere shadow of its potential. But war, particularly a total war, has an astonishing way of awakening sleeping giants, of transforming dormant capabilities into overwhelming power. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, didn't just bring America into the war militarily. It unleashed industrial forces that would fundamentally reshape the global balance of power, creating an economic and logistical tsunami that no adversary could withstand. Willis Overland's Toledo factory, once a struggling car manufacturer barely keeping its head above water, transformed almost overnight into the pulsating heart of a production miracle. Assembly lines that had been producing a few dozen cars per day were reconfigured, retooled, and reimagined in a matter of weeks, shifting from family sedans to producing hundreds of military vehicles. Workers who had been carefully assembling civilian models found themselves constructing machines of war at speeds that defied belief, a furious ballet of human hands and automated machinery. The transformation was both physical and profoundly psychological. Factory floors were reorganized according to the principles of mass production that Henry Ford had pioneered decades earlier, but which now reached new, unimaginable heights of efficiency and scale. Raw materials, steel, rubber, glass, copper, flowed in one end of these colossal plants, and finished battle-ready vehicles rolled out the other, every step between optimized for blistering speed and minimal waste. But more than just efficiency, a profound sense of purpose permeated these factories. The workers understood, with crystal clarity, that they weren't just building vehicles or assembling parts. They were building weapons to protect their sons, their brothers, their husbands, their fathers overseas. Every single vehicle completed, every component meticulously installed, was a blow against the Axis powers. Every improvement in production, every shaved second, was a step closer to victory, to bringing their loved ones home. The human dimension of this industrial transformation cannot be overstated. Factories that had employed hundreds now employed thousands, swelling with patriotic fervor and unprecedented opportunity. Women, who had never before held industrial jobs, found themselves welding chassis with newfound skill and installing engines with surprising dexterity, their smaller, more nimble hands sometimes better suited to navigating the tight spaces of an engine bay than men's. Teenagers too young for military service worked night shifts after school, proudly contributing to the war effort, their youth infused with a sense of collective purpose. The assembly lines became melting pots of American society, united by a common enemy and a shared determination. The sheer numbers tell only part of this astonishing story. In 1941, the combined production from all manufacturers totaled a respectable but still modest 16,000 vehicles. By 1942, that number exploded, surging to an incredible 177,759. At the peak of production in 1943 and 1944, American factories were completing one of these vital vehicles every 90 seconds, around the clock, day and night, without pause. To put this in stark, almost unbelievable perspective, Germany's entire production of their roughly equivalent Kübelwagens for the entire war, 5 long years of conflict, barely exceeded what American factories produced in a mere 3 months. It was an industrial tsunami. But statistics, as powerful as they are, don't fully capture the human drama of this transformation. Factories ran 24 hours a day, their windows painted black for air raid protection that, thankfully, never came to the American heartland. The night shifts worked under harsh fluorescent lights, the constant clatter, clang, and roar of assembly lines creating a relentless, rhythmic soundscape that workers often reported hearing even in their sleep. Lunch breaks were often eaten right on the line, workers chewing sandwiches while waiting for the next component to arrive, unwilling to waste a single precious moment. Workers who exceeded quotas had their names proudly posted on honor boards, celebrated as home front heroes. Those who suggested improvements that increased production, even by a fraction, received war bonds as tangible rewards for their ingenuity. Workers developed their own deeply personal culture around the vehicles they built, imbuing them with hopes and prayers. There are documented cases of women secretly sewing boyfriends' or husbands' names into seat cushions, a tender, almost magical act, hoping somehow, impossibly, the vehicle would find its way to their loved one overseas. Men slipped handwritten notes behind dashboards with messages of encouragement and defiance. "Give 'em hell from Detroit," one read. "Built with pride in Toledo," said another. One factory worker later recalled using chalk to write, "Give 'em hell" on engine blocks, knowing it would wear off quickly, but feeling an undeniable compulsion to send some message of support with each vehicle. Quality control inspectors, during their meticulous checks, often found good luck charms welded subtly into frames, small religious medals tucked into tool compartments, even folded love letters hidden in hollow frame tubes. A small tarnished metal cross was discovered inside a chassis rail years after the war, placed there by some unknown worker as a silent blessing. Managers initially tried to stop these practices, viewing them as unprofessional or a potential distraction, but they quickly gave up when they realized it significantly improved morale and, crucially, didn't affect performance. Some even actively encouraged it, understanding that workers who felt personally connected to their products, who believed they were building more than just a machine, worked harder, more carefully, and with a greater sense of pride. These vehicles weren't just machines rolling off assembly lines. They were messages from America to its soldiers, each one carrying not just steel and rubber, but the hopes, prayers, and fierce determination of a nation. One supervisor vividly recalled watching a woman on the assembly line kiss her hand and then touch it to each vehicle as it passed her station. When gently asked why, she simply said with tears in her eyes that her son was in Italy and she hoped one of her vehicles would help bring him home. Another worker, a German immigrant, was seen crying silently as he worked. He explained through his tears that he was building weapons with his own hands to defeat the Nazis who had driven him from his beloved homeland. These were not just nameless cogs in a vast industrial machine. They were individual acts of defiance, hope, and vengeance. Detroit's contribution, beyond Willys Overland, was equally remarkable. Ford's massive River Rouge plant, already legendary for its sheer size and integrated manufacturing capabilities, dedicated entire buildings to military production, transforming acres of civilian assembly lines. Henry Ford, despite his earlier isolationist leanings, threw his company's full weight behind the war effort, a pivot of immense national significance. Following military requirements for distributed manufacturing, a strategic move to prevent a single successful bombing raid or act of sabotage from crippling production, Ford also set up assembly lines in Dallas, Chicago, and Louisville. Though the continental United States never faced such threats, this decentralization proved to be a stroke of genius, creating resilience and redundancy. Each plant developed its own unique character, its own innovations, its own fierce pride in production. Dallas workers painted small Texas stars on chassis rails. Chicago's plant had a tradition of workers signing their names on a hidden panel of every 100th vehicle. Louisville's workers, many of them women, became known for consistently achieving the highest quality ratings. The supply chain for this unprecedented production stretched across the entire country, like a vast, complex circulatory system pumping lifeblood into the war effort. Steel from Pittsburgh, heated in furnaces that glowed day and night, was transformed into chassis and body panels. Rubber from Akron, where tire companies converted from civilian to military production, became tires that could withstand unimaginable abuse. Glass from Toledo, where workers learned to cut windshields that could fold flat, offering versatility and reducing glare. Electrical components from Chicago, where companies that had made radios now made military switches and gauges. Small, intricate parts flowed from hundreds, then thousands of subcontractors who had never made military equipment before but now eagerly answered the call. This mobilization reached into every corner of American industry, revealing an astonishing flexibility and adaptability. A company that made sewing machines retooled its precision machinery to produce gear shifters. A bicycle manufacturer started making drive shafts. A toy company, with its expertise in small mechanisms, began producing dashboard instruments. A kitchen appliance manufacturer, known for its stoves and refrigerators, began making carburetors. Each transformation represented American industrial flexibility, the ability to rapidly transform civilian production into overwhelming military might. It was capitalism and patriotism merged into an unstoppable, singular force. Companies that had been bitter competitors shared information, designs, and techniques to increase overall production, often at the explicit urging of the government. Patents were temporarily suspended for the duration of the war. Trade secrets, usually fiercely guarded, became common knowledge if they could help the war effort. The normal rules of business, the fierce competition for market share and profit, were suspended in favor of a greater existential goal. Profit margins were controlled by the government, but the sheer volume of orders more than made up for it. Companies that had struggled and barely survived during the Depression years suddenly found themselves with more orders than they could possibly fill, hiring workers as fast as they could train them. The economic transformation was as remarkable as the industrial one. Towns that had been dying, their factories shuttered, revived as new plants expanded or old ones reopened. Workers who had been unemployed for years found themselves earning steady wages they'd never dreamed of, pouring their income into war bonds and savings accounts, inadvertently creating the immense capital that would fuel post-war prosperity. German intelligence, receiving reports of this staggering production, initially dismissed them as blatant Allied propaganda, wildly exaggerated figures designed to demoralize the Reich. Surely no nation, not even the United States, could produce vehicles at such astronomical rates. Their own factories, even working with forced labor and under immense pressure, couldn't approach these numbers. The Wehrmacht's entire motor pool, accumulated over years of conquest and meticulous planning, was being matched by American production every few months. When prisoner interrogations, corroborated by captured documents, began to confirm the truly incredible figures, German officers accused the Americans of lying, of fabricating impossible statistics. It simply seemed impossible that a nation that had been militarily negligible just years before, without a large standing army or a war-ready industrial complex, could suddenly outproduce the combined industrial might of the Reich, which had been preparing for war for a decade. German industrial planning had assumed they would face an enemy that fought like they did, with carefully husbanded resources, precision-engineered equipment, and limited, though high-quality, production. They expected a chess match of strategic deployment and technological one-upmanship. Instead, they faced an avalanche of adequate equipment, a relentless churning flood that would ultimately bury their technical excellence under sheer, unassailable quantity. It wasn't about building a better mousetrap, it was about building so many mousetraps that the mice simply drowned. But the vehicles kept coming, in numbers that defied comprehension. Shipped in crates that could be assembled in under an hour, with instructions so simple that one mechanic joked a child could follow them. Stacked on transport ships like cordwood, filling every available space, maximizing every cubic inch of cargo hold, flowing through British ports in endless streams that port workers, witnessing the ceaseless arrival, said looked like rivers of steel. By mid-1942, they were arriving in North Africa faster than Rommel's vaunted Africa Corps could possibly destroy them. For every vehicle lost to enemy action, 2 more seemed to arrive. For every one destroyed by mechanical failure, 3 more rolled off the ships. It wasn't just production, it was a flood, a tide of practical machinery that would fundamentally reshape the entire concept of mechanized warfare. The Germans had revolutionized warfare with their Blitzkrieg, the lightning war of concentrated armor and rapid advance. The Americans, with their humble, ubiquitous vehicle, were revolutionizing it again, but with something far more fundamental: the ability to be everywhere at once, to replace losses instantly, to maintain an unrelenting tempo indefinitely. This was not a weapon that conquered, it was a weapon that enabled. The transformation from factory floor to battlefield happened with stunning speed, astonishing even American planners. In early 1942, most American soldiers had never even seen one of these new vehicles, much less driven one. By the end of the year, they were utterly ubiquitous, an indispensable part of every unit. The speed of deployment surprised everyone. Ships would dock in British ports, and within hours, sometimes minutes, vehicles would be assembled, fueled, and driven away by troops who had received only the most basic training, a testament to their intuitive design. The learning curve was incredibly steep, but remarkably short. Soldiers who first encountered these new vehicles often shared the initial German skepticism. Tankers, accustomed to riding in tons of protective armor, scoffed at the exposed seating, the lack of any real protection. Infantry, accustomed to the grueling routine of walking everywhere, carrying everything on their backs, wondered why they needed what looked like a militarized farm vehicle. Cavalry officers, still mourning the loss of their beloved horses and the romanticized traditions of mounted warfare, saw it as a poor, ignoble substitute for a proper mount. The institutional resistance was real. Military doctrine literally had no pre-existing place for such a versatile, uncategorizable vehicle. They didn't fit into existing tables of organization. Were they reconnaissance vehicles? Transport? Weapons carriers? The answer, as troops would quickly discover, was a resounding yes to all of the above and more. That initial skepticism, however, evaporated with first use, melting away in the scorching heat of North Africa and the brutal cold of the Russian winter. In North Africa, where the war first tested American forces against German veterans, these vehicles proved their worth immediately, dramatically, decisively. The British Long-Range Desert Group, LRDG, elite raiders who had operated deep behind German lines since 1940, discovered that these seemingly fragile vehicles could traverse sand that stopped much heavier trucks floating over dunes where others sank. They could carry enough fuel, water, and supplies for extended, weeks-long raids, mount machine guns for devastating firepower, and still move fast enough to strike hard and disappear before German forces could effectively respond. The LRDG raiders, masters of improvisation, modified their vehicles extensively, each one becoming a personalized, mobile weapons platform. They removed windshields for better visibility, the glass useless and prone to glare in a land without rain. They added extra fuel tanks, doubling and even tripling their operational range, enabling audacious deep penetration missions. They mounted multiple weapons, twin Vickers machine guns, captured German MG-34s, even 20mm cannons salvaged from downed aircraft. Each raid, each foray behind enemy lines proved the vehicle's astonishing adaptability. Where German vehicles required specific high-octane fuel, these American machines ran on whatever was available: aviation gas, diesel mixed with gasoline, even alcohol-based fuels when desperate. Where German vehicles demanded specific, precision-machined spare parts, these could be repaired with salvaged materials, scraps, and sheer ingenuity. One raid report described a vehicle running for 3 days with a makeshift piston carved from an aluminum mess kit. Another told of a transmission repaired with parts from a captured Italian truck. The Desert War became a living laboratory for innovation, a proving ground for radical simplicity. Vehicles designed for basic transport became mobile gun platforms, command posts, ambulances, and scout vehicles, limited only by the imagination and ingenuity of combat soldiers, who proved remarkably creative under pressure. They discovered that the vehicle's lightweight, which seemed like such a profound disadvantage, was actually a critical asset, allowing them to float over soft sand where heavier vehicles sank into immobilization. The high ground clearance meant they could traverse rocky, broken terrain that would tear out the undercarriage of conventional trucks. Medical units found they could evacuate wounded faster and more effectively than ever before, dramatically improving survival rates. Traditional battlefield evacuation relied on stretcher bearers carrying wounded men, often under fire, to aid stations, a slow, dangerous, and often fatal process. Now, a vehicle could reach wounded men in terrain where ambulances couldn't go, carry them swiftly and relatively comfortably to aid stations, and then return for more. One medic in Italy reported evacuating 12 men in a single night using just one of these vehicles, saving lives that would have been tragically lost, waiting for stretcher bearers. The speed of evacuation dramatically improved survival rates, often meaning the difference between life and death. The golden hour, the critical first 60 minutes after wounding, became achievable even in the most difficult terrain. In some units, the vehicles became so intimately associated with medical evacuation that wounded soldiers, in their delirium, would call out for them by name rather than calling for medics. "Get me a jeep!" became the urgent cry of wounded men who knew their best chance of survival lay in rapid evacuation. This wasn't just a vehicle. It was a mobile lifeline, a beacon of hope in the hell of battle. Artillery units discovered they could move guns faster and more flexibly than ever before, transforming the dynamics of battlefield support. Traditional artillery deployment required teams of horses or heavy trucks to drag guns into position, a slow, laborious, and vulnerable process. Now, a small, agile vehicle could tow anti-tank guns into position, unhitch, provide crucial support, and disappear before counterfire could even be aimed. When positions were overrun or a rapid redeployment was necessary, The guns could be hitched and moved in minutes rather than being abandoned, saving precious equipment and lives. One artillery officer noted, with a mixture of awe and relief, that his unit's survival rate for guns improved by an astonishing 300% after receiving these versatile vehicles. The very mathematics of artillery engagement changed. Guns could be employed more aggressively, positioned closer to the front lines, and moved more frequently, making them incredibly difficult targets for enemy counter-battery fire. These vehicles allowed a flexibility that horse-drawn artillery could never match, and that even heavier, self-propelled mechanized artillery struggled to achieve. Battery commanders, who had spent their careers thinking in terms of static positions, now thought in terms of mobile firepower, transforming their tactical approaches. But it was in reconnaissance and communication where the vehicles truly excelled, becoming the eyes and ears of the advancing Allied armies. They could probe enemy positions with speed and agility, race back with critical intelligence, and deliver it faster than any previous method, often directly to the frontline commanders. Radio-equipped versions became mobile command posts, allowing officers to actually lead from the front, seeing conditions firsthand rather than from static headquarters miles behind the lines, dependent on outdated reports. The transformation of command and control was nothing short of revolutionary. In previous wars, generals commanded from chateaus miles from the actual fighting, dependent on runners, telephone lines, and often slow, unreliable information. Now they could be at the sharp end, seeing conditions firsthand, making decisions based on immediate observation rather than hours-old reports. The fog of war, while never entirely eliminated, lifted considerably for American commanders, providing them with an unprecedented clarity of battlefield awareness. These vehicles carried everything and anything. Ammunition when supplies ran low, each capable of carrying hundreds of pounds of shells or thousands of rounds of small arms ammunition to critical positions. Hot food to frontline positions. Field kitchens loading insulated containers that kept meals warm for hours. A profound morale booster for exhausted troops. Mail that maintained morale. Soldiers often saying that letters from home mattered more than ammunition, a tangible link to the world they were fighting for. Replacement parts for other equipment, transforming them into mobile workshops that could repair weapons and radios in the field. Engineers used them to string telephone wire, laying communication lines at speeds that astounded Signal Corps veterans, accelerating the establishment of crucial networks. One report described laying 20 miles of wire in a single day, a task that would have taken a week with traditional methods. They became the circulatory system of modern armies, carrying the lifeblood of supplies and information wherever needed, a testament to their sheer utilitarian adaptability. Personal stories, rich with heroism and ingenuity, emerged from every theater of war, each illustrating the vehicle's profound impact on individual lives and the broader campaign. A driver in the Philippines used his vehicle to evacuate an entire village ahead of a brutal Japanese advance, making trip after trip as enemy forces closed in, a one-man rescue mission against impossible odds. A reconnaissance team in France discovered a critical, unguarded gap in German lines, wide enough for an entire division to push through, their intelligence leading to a breakthrough that shortened the war by weeks. A supply sergeant with unwavering determination kept an isolated unit fed and armed for 2 weeks by making nightly runs through enemy territory, dodging patrols and navigating by starlight, a lifeline in the darkness. These stories, multiplied thousands of times across the globe, created a powerful mythology around these vehicles. They became tangible symbols of American ingenuity, reliability, and sheer, stubborn determination. Soldiers didn't just use these vehicles, they lived with them, depended on them, often loved them with an almost human affection. Names painted on hoods reflected this deeply personal relationship. Lucky Lady carried a reconnaissance team through the entire Italian campaign without a single serious breakdown. Berlin or Bust made it all the way from the Normandy beaches to the Elbe River. Mom's taxi evacuated over 100 wounded soldiers, a tireless angel of mercy. Hitler's nightmare, mounted with so many weapons it looked like a porcupine, became a rolling fortress. The last name would prove far more prophetic than its painter probably imagined, because by 1943, these ubiquitous vehicles were indeed becoming a living nightmare for German military planners, who simply couldn't comprehend how they seemed to be everywhere at once, swarming like angry bees, relentlessly probing, flanking, and overwhelming. The German military mind, meticulously trained in precision, order, and hierarchical control, simply couldn't grasp the chaotic flexibility and decentralized effectiveness that these vehicles enabled and, in fact, thrived in. German military doctrine of 1940 had seemed invincible, a revolutionary paradigm. Fast-moving panzer divisions, supported by mechanized infantry and dive bombers, had crushed Poland in weeks, France in days, and driven deep into Russia with initial successes that stunned the world and rewrote the rules of warfare. They replaced the static, brutal trenches of World War I with fluid, mobile operations that emphasized speed, surprise, and overwhelming concentration of force at critical points. But this doctrine, in its very elegance and specialization, had a fatal flaw, one that only became apparent over time and under the grinding pressure of total war. It depended heavily on relatively small numbers of highly sophisticated, precision-engineered vehicles operating with careful, centralized coordination. The panzer divisions that had terrorized Europe, while formidable, represented a tiny, elite fraction of the German army. The vast majority of German soldiers still walked to battle, their supplies still moved by thousands of horse-drawn wagons, a stark contrast to their cutting-edge mechanized spearhead. The mechanized units were the highly polished, meticulously sharpened tip of a very traditional, largely foot-bound spear. When those highly complex vehicles broke down, as they inevitably did under combat conditions, specialized repair units, often from factory teams, were needed. German tanks were maintenance-intensive, requiring specialized tools, highly trained mechanics, and specific, often hard-to-source spare parts. When they ran out of fuel, specific, carefully planned supply chains had to function perfectly to replenish them. The logistics of keeping a Tiger tank operational were staggering. It consumed fuel at rates that would have emptied the tank of any other vehicle in hours. When terrain didn't suit them, entire operations ground to a halt, immobilized by mud, mountains, or broken roads. The vast, unforgiving steppes of Russia, the rugged, ancient mountains of Italy, the dense bocage country of France, each presented challenges that German vehicles, designed for the open plains of Europe, struggled to overcome. The doctrine that had worked so well in the open plains of Poland and France proved far less adaptable to varied terrain and extended, chaotic operations. The first ominous hints of trouble came from North Africa, where the Desert War, with its extreme temperatures, vast distances, and punishing terrain, tested mechanical reliability like no European battlefield. Rommel's Africa Corps began reporting enemy reconnaissance units that seemed to multiply like desert mirages, appearing and disappearing with uncanny speed. They would materialize on flanks thought secure, report German positions with unnerving accuracy, and vanish before pursuit could be organized. Destroying one meant absolutely nothing. 5 more would appear the next day, always probing, always harassing. German motorcycle reconnaissance units, previously the fastest scouts on the battlefield, found themselves consistently outmaneuvered, their vulnerability starkly exposed. The motorcycles that had served so well on the paved roads of Europe proved fragile and unreliable in the desert. They struggled in soft sand, broke down frequently in the intense heat, and offered absolutely no protection to their riders against enemy fire or the elements. Meanwhile, the American vehicles bounced across terrain that stopped motorcycles cold, their crews exposed but effective. Reports reaching Berlin further puzzled the high command. Enemy vehicles were being used in ways that utterly defied German military categorization. The same vehicle that carried ammunition to the front lines in the morning might evacuate wounded in the afternoon and mount a reconnaissance patrol at night. German doctrine rigidly assigned specific vehicles to specific roles, a clear hierarchy of function. This universal employment, this blurring of lines, seemed chaotic, undisciplined, unprofessional. How could you possibly maintain proper military order? How could you plan with precision when vehicles had no fixed purpose, no immutable role? But what seemed like chaos to German minds was, in fact, ultimate flexibility to American thinking. The ability to use any vehicle for any purpose meant that every vehicle was always useful, always contributing, always adaptable. There was no idle capacity, no specialized equipment sitting unused, waiting for its specific mission, a luxury the Germans could not afford. More disturbing still were the reports filtering in from the Eastern Front after American Lend-Lease vehicles began arriving in significant numbers in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union received over 50,000 of these vehicles through the Lend-Lease program, a staggering injection of mobility that dramatically transformed the capabilities of the Red Army. Soviet forces, which had been virtually immobile and reliant on traditional horse-drawn transport, suddenly gained new flexibility and speed. Partisan units, previously limited to arduous foot movement, could now strike deeper and more effectively behind German lines, harassing supply routes and sowing chaos. The vehicles seemed to thrive in conditions that destroyed German equipment. They ran reliably in cold that froze German engines solid. Their simple air-cooled engines, or robust water-cooled ones, starting when the water-cooled German engines cracked under extreme thermal stress. They traversed mud that swallowed German trucks whole, their four-wheel drive and high clearance conquering the notorious Russian Rasputitsa, the season of mud that had stopped invaders since Napoleon. Soviet mechanics, often working in primitive conditions, found they could easily maintain these vehicles with basic tools and minimal training, a stark contrast to the highly specialized requirements of German equipment. German vehicles required heated workshops, specialized equipment, and factory-trained mechanics. American vehicles could be repaired in the field by peasants who had never seen a car before the war, a testament to their user-friendly, robust design. The cultural shock was profound. German military tradition emphasized expertise, specialization, and professional competence. These vehicles could be operated and maintained by amateurs, by anyone. It seemed to violate every principle of proper military organization, every cherished tenet of efficiency and mastery. Yet, it worked. Soviet forces that had been tied to railroads and main roads gained unprecedented cross-country mobility. Supplies reached units that had been cut off. Commanders could visit frontline positions, seeing the grim reality for themselves, instead of relying on slow, often inaccurate reports. A captured German intelligence report from 1943 reveals the growing concern, the palpable frustration within the Wehrmacht. It noted, with a distinct tone of bewilderment, that American forces seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of these reconnaissance vehicles, and that their ubiquitous presence usually indicated imminent offensive operations. The report's language betrays frustration and a deep sense of powerlessness. How could the Americans produce so many? It implicitly asked. How could they be everywhere? The report even recommended that German forces develop similar vehicles, but concluded that it was impossible given the Reich's severe industrial constraints. Germany's factories were already straining under the immense pressure to produce tanks, aircraft, and U-boats, the complex machines that embodied their vision of warfare. Retooling for simple vehicles seemed like a step backward, an admission of defeat to their own engineering prowess. The German industrial complex, geared toward producing engineering masterpieces, couldn't easily shift to mass-producing simple, good-enough machines. They were trapped by their own success, by their very philosophy. The mathematics of this war, for German planners, were becoming brutally clear and deeply unfavorable. Their factories could produce perhaps 100 sophisticated vehicles per month, each one a triumph of engineering, a testament to precision and craftsmanship. American factories, by contrast, were producing that many in a mere 3 hours, each one adequate, dependable, and readily available for its purpose. Worse still, German vehicles required extensive maintenance, specialized parts, and highly trained crews. A single Tiger tank required a crew of 5 highly trained specialists, each an expert in their role. American vehicles could be maintained by anyone who could hold a wrench, and driven by anyone who had operated a car, accelerating training and reducing the burden on skilled manpower. German fuel consumption was twice as high, a critical liability in a war where fuel was becoming critically short, their synthetic fuel plants being systematically bombed into oblivion by Allied air raids. Meanwhile, American vehicles sipped fuel at rates that extended their operational range far beyond German calculations, further increasing their ubiquity and effectiveness. By late 1943, the relentless, omnipresent presence of these vehicles had become a psychological weapon in itself, sowing seeds of paranoia and demoralization among German troops. German soldiers reported hearing their distinctive, higher-pitched engine sound at night, and knowing, with a chill, that it meant they were being scouted for an impending attack. The sound, almost cheerful in its mechanical tone compared to the deeper growl of German engines, became inextricably associated with impending danger, with relentless pursuit. Veterans learned to distinguish it from other vehicles at distances of half a mile or more. The vehicle's uncanny ability to appear anywhere, anytime, created a pervasive paranoia. Every copse of trees might hide reconnaissance teams. Every distant hill might conceal artillery observers. Every seemingly deserted road junction might suddenly fill with fast-moving infantry, appearing as if from nowhere. German units began posting extra sentries, conducting endless, exhausting patrols, wearing themselves out trying to prevent infiltration that seemed utterly inevitable. One German officer, writing bitterly in his diary, lamented that fighting Americans was like fighting ghosts. They were everywhere and nowhere, moving too fast to pin down, appearing in strength where least expected. He blamed it, with a mixture of frustration and contempt, on their verdammten kleinen Autos, their damned little cars. His diary, captured after his death in Normandy, revealed the profound frustration of a professional soldier facing an enemy that simply didn't fight by the rigid, predictable rules he understood. Where was the proper order of battle? Where were the fixed positions, the clear lines of engagement? How could you possibly plan operations when the enemy might appear anywhere, at any time, in any configuration? The American way of war, decentralized, adaptable, and enabled by these simple, ubiquitous vehicles, was utterly overturning decades of established military doctrine, rendering it obsolete in the crucible of real combat. The Normandy invasion, June 6, 1944, famously known as D-Day, showcased the full, overwhelming impact of American vehicle production and logistics. As Allied forces stormed the beaches, specialized landing craft began disgorging vehicles almost immediately, an endless stream of steel and rubber pouring onto French soil. The meticulous planning for D-Day had recognized that success depended not just on securing beachheads, but on the rapid buildup of mobile forces, the ability to punch inland and exploit any breach. Every landing craft was calculated to carry the maximum possible number of vehicles. Some were specially waterproofed for deep wading, their engines and electrical systems sealed against corrosive saltwater, designed to drive straight off the ramps into the surf. Others were packed in crates like oversized Lego sets that could be assembled on the beach in minutes, ready to roll. Within hours of the first wave hitting the beaches, these ubiquitous vehicles were operating on French soil, ferrying troops, supplies, and communications. The sheer speed of their deployment stunned German defenders, who were expecting a more traditional, slower buildup of forces. Wehrmacht doctrine assumed that invading forces would need days to organize their units, weeks to build up essential supplies and heavy equipment. Instead, mobile American units, riding in these agile machines, were pushing inland within hours, rapidly securing objectives and expanding the beachhead. By D-Day +1, hundreds were operating inland. By the end of the first week, thousands, a seemingly endless torrent of mobility. They poured off ships in endless streams, pre-packed in configurations that maximized shipping space, a logistical marvel. The sheer complexity of this deployment was staggering. Each vehicle was treated not as a separate item, but as a component in a vast, interconnected machine. They were loaded in reverse order of need. The first ones needed on the beach were the last ones loaded onto the ships, ready to roll off the moment the landing craft hit the sand. Beachmaster units used them to coordinate the chaos of the landing areas, racing between ships and shore to direct traffic, maintain order, and expedite the flow of men and material. Engineers used them to mark cleared lanes through minefields, their mobility allowing them to map safe routes faster than ever before. Military police used them to direct the growing flood of men and material inland, standing at crucial intersections to prevent the debilitating traffic jams that could have turned the beaches into an even greater killing ground. French civilians, witnessing their liberation arrive on four wheels, began calling them Roosevelt's horses. The name captured something essential. Like the cavalry of old, they provided mobility, speed, and shock. But unlike horses, they never tired, never needed rest, and could run day and night as long as fuel lasted. One French resistance member later recalled watching a column of these vehicles pass through his village for 6 straight hours. Nothing but these small, unassuming machines loaded with troops and supplies, moving inland at speeds that made traditional pursuit utterly impossible. The psychological impact on French civilians was profound. After 4 brutal years of occupation, seeing this seemingly endless stream of American vehicles meant that liberation was real, irreversible, and overwhelming. German forces might conduct fighting retreats, but they could never match this relentless mobility, this endless stream of men and machines. The German response revealed their growing desperation and confusion. Orders went out to prioritize destroying these vehicles, but they were simply too many, too dispersed, too nimble. Destroying 10 meant nothing when 50 more appeared the next day, seemingly out of thin air. Luftwaffe pilots reported immense frustration trying to strafe columns that could scatter into woods or buildings in seconds. The vehicles' small size and agility made them incredibly difficult targets for fast-moving aircraft. Unlike truck convoys that were confined to roads, these vehicles could disperse across fields, take cover in orchards, hide in villages, melting into the landscape. Tank commanders found that pursuing them meant exposing their flanks to the anti-tank guns they often towed, a deadly trap. The 57mm anti-tank guns, while not capable of defeating heavy German armor frontally, could penetrate side armor at close range, a brutal equalizer. Vehicle crews became expert at ambush tactics, using their mobility to attack from unexpected angles, then disappearing before the Germans could effectively retaliate. By August 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy became a masterclass in mobility warfare. Patton's Third Army, equipped with thousands of these vehicles, achieved advances that seemed utterly impossible by traditional military calculations. They moved faster than German intelligence could track, appearing on flanks and rear areas before defensive positions could even be established. The famous dash across France saw American units advancing 50 miles a day, sometimes more, covering ground at a pace previously unseen in warfare. German staff officers, meticulously trained to think in terms of walking infantry and horse-drawn supplies, simply couldn't adjust their calculations to this new, lightning-fast reality. Defensive lines drawn on maps were outdated before orders could even be issued. Cities marked as strong points were bypassed before garrisons even knew the enemy was near. The German retreat became a nightmare of constant movement, ceaseless harassment. Units would establish defensive positions only to find American reconnaissance already behind them, reporting their every move. Supply columns couldn't move without being spotted and attacked. The Jabos, the Allied fighter bombers, seemed to have eyes everywhere, called in by mobile observers in these ubiquitous vehicles, who reported every German movement, every flicker of activity. Command posts had to relocate constantly as fast-moving American units threatened to overrun them. The traditional German strength, professional staff work, meticulous planning, and adherence to doctrine, ironically became a profound weakness when the enemy moved faster than any plans could be made, faster than any orders could be disseminated. One German general staff officer later wrote that the entire campaign felt like being hunted by a swarm of mechanical insects. They were individually insignificant, he conceded, but collectively overwhelming, relentless, everywhere. Destroying them was like trying to stop the rain by shooting at clouds. His metaphor powerfully captured the profound futility of fighting an enemy that had achieved true mass mobilization, an enemy that operated on an entirely different scale of technological and logistical capability. The numbers, by late 1944, defied comprehension. American forces in Europe alone operated over 200,000 of these vehicles. To put that in perspective, Germany's entire production of their roughly equivalent Kübelwagen totaled barely 50,000 for the entire war. The ratio was a staggering 4:1 in raw numbers, but the reality was even worse because American vehicles lasted longer, required far less maintenance, and could be repaired faster. When American vehicles broke down, they were usually running again within hours, a testament to their robust simplicity. When German vehicles broke down, with their complex, specialized parts, they often stayed broken, cannibalized for parts to keep other precious machines running, a slow, agonizing bleed of combat power. The Wehrmacht's vehicle strength decreased every single day, while American strength increased. It was a mathematical certainty that pointed to only one grim outcome. But it wasn't just raw numbers. It was presence, the strategic ubiquity. These vehicles allowed American forces to be everywhere simultaneously, a truly terrifying prospect for a defensive army. Every crossroads could be scouted, every bridge watched, every German movement observed and reported in real time. The battlefield, once shrouded in the traditional fog of war, became remarkably transparent to American commanders, while remaining opaque, confusing, and terrifyingly unpredictable to the Germans. Intelligence that had once taken days to gather and transmit now flowed in real time, or near real time. Commanders could make rapid, decisive decisions based on current information rather than outdated reports or best guesses. This omnipresence had profound psychological effects. German soldiers began reporting symptoms of paranoia and overwhelming anxiety. The distinctive sound of the four-cylinder engines, once dismissed as a minor annoyance, triggered anxiety attacks, a Pavlovian response to impending danger. Units refused to move during daylight, knowing they would be spotted immediately by the ever-present reconnaissance. The breakdown in German morale was accelerated by the stark contrast in mobility. Wehrmacht soldiers, many of whom were marching on foot by 1944, exhausted and demoralized, watched with bitter resignation as seemingly endless columns of American forces raced past in their versatile vehicles, always moving, always advancing. The psychological impact of walking while your enemy rides, of realizing your industrial base is utterly outmatched, cannot be overstated. It spoke volumes about industrial inferiority, about losing the technological race, about inevitable defeat. Morale plummeted as soldiers realized they were facing not just an army, but an entire nation's industrial output, mobilized and focused with terrible, overwhelming efficiency. Meanwhile, for American soldiers, these vehicles had become profound symbols of their advantage, their resilience, and their inevitable victory. They represented not just mobility, but the entire American approach to war, practical, efficient, overwhelming in quantity, and endlessly adaptable. One GI, writing home to his family, famously encapsulated this sentiment. "The Germans make beautiful machines," he wrote, with a hint of admiration. "But we make so many that beautiful doesn't matter." His letter, one of millions that discussed these vehicles, showed how deeply they had entered American military consciousness. They weren't just tools of war, they were symbols of American industrial democracy defeating European fascism, a tangible representation of a free society's ability to outproduce and out-innovate an authoritarian one. These vehicles also fundamentally changed the relationship between soldiers and their equipment. German military tradition emphasized distance, formality, and rigid protocol between man and machine. Vehicles were state property, to be maintained according to strict, complex regulations by specialized personnel. American soldiers, by contrast, treated their vehicles as personal space, extensions of their home on wheels. They modified them, decorated them, lived in them, personalized them in myriad ways. This casual familiarity, far from being unprofessional, bred an unexpected expertise and a deep sense of ownership. Drivers knew every subtle sound their engine made, could diagnose problems by feel alone, understood their vehicle's unique capabilities and limitations intimately. It was a democratization of military technology, an empowerment of the common soldier that German officers, steeped in generations of Prussian tradition, found utterly incomprehensible and often vaguely disturbing. It challenged their very notion of military order. By spring 1945, as Allied forces pushed relentlessly into Germany itself, the full, crushing weight of American production became undeniable. Every American division operated with complete motorization. Every single soldier could ride rather than walk, preserving energy and accelerating movement. Every gun could be moved rather than abandoned, maintaining firepower. Every supply dump could be relocated quickly as front lines shifted, ensuring continuous support. The contrast with German forces was stark, brutal, and humiliating. Wehrmacht units that had conquered Europe on wheels and tracks now retreated on foot, exhausted, defeated. Horses, requisitioned from desperate farms, pulled artillery pieces originally designed for motor transport, a stark symbol of their decline. Proud panzer divisions, which had once symbolized German military might and technological superiority, were reduced to scattered vehicles, hoarded like precious jewels for want of fuel or parts, their formidable power rendered inert. The irony was profoundly bitter for German commanders. They had invented modern mechanized warfare with their revolutionary Blitzkrieg tactics. They had shown the world that future wars would be won by engines, by speed, by mobility, not by legs or by sheer mass of infantry. Now they watched in impotent despair as their enemies, particularly the Americans, perfected what they had begun, taking mechanization to levels Germany, with its limited resources and rigid philosophy, could never achieve. The student had surpassed the master in the most humiliating, overwhelming fashion possible. German staff officers who had lectured at prestigious war colleges about the principles of mobile warfare now found themselves commanding demoralized foot infantry retreating before an entirely motorized enemy, an enemy they could not catch, could not pin down, could not stop. The refugee columns fleeing the advancing Allies told the story in stark, human terms. German civilians, Nazi party officials, and disintegrating military units moved painfully on foot, in horse carts, on bicycles, their faces etched with despair. Passing them at speed were endless columns of American vehicles, carrying fresh troops, distributing rations to hungry civilians, a stark visual contrast. The nation that had proclaimed itself the master race was being overrun by forces riding in vehicles they had dismissed as inadequate, as toys. The 1,000-year Reich was ending with Germans walking while Americans rode. Abandoned German vehicles littered the roadsides, each a silent, rusting testament to mechanical superiority, defeated by numerical inferiority and a lack of adaptability. Tigers and Panthers, engineering marvels that had once terrorized Allied forces, sat motionless for want of fuel or minor, irreplaceable parts. Their complex systems, masterpieces of engineering when working perfectly, became crushing liabilities when they failed in the unforgiving conditions of retreat. Beside them, American vehicles bounced past, battered and patched, often sporting crude field repairs, but still running, always moving. German mechanics, who had spent years maintaining highly complex machines, watched in disbelief as American drivers performed repairs with basic tools and astonishing ingenuity. A broken fuel pump fixed with a piece of wire, a damaged radiator sealed with chewing gum, a patched tire held together with rope. Improvisation, resilience, and adaptability triumphing over rigid, brittle engineering. The final statistics revealed the production gap in stark, unassailable numbers. From 1941 to 1945, American manufacturers built approximately 643,000 quarter-ton vehicles. Willys produced 363,000 units, while Ford manufactured 280,000. Bantam's initial contribution of 2,675 vehicles, though numerically small, had proven the critical concept, laying the intellectual groundwork that made mass production possible. When amphibious variants and specialized versions were included, total production approached an astonishing 650,000 units. To this could be added the countless modifications and variants produced in field workshops, each representing American adaptability and ingenuity. The numbers were staggering, but they only told part of the story. Each vehicle represented thousands of hours of labor, tons of steel and rubber, gallons of fuel, and the focused collective effort of a nation fully mobilized for total war. The Wehrmacht, which began the war with arguably the most mechanized army in the world, ended it desperately short of transport, its logistical backbone shattered. Their Kubelwagen, the closest equivalent to the American vehicle, saw only 50,435 produced over 5 years. Even combining all German light vehicle types couldn't match American production of this single versatile model. The Schwimmwagen, their amphibious vehicle, totaled a mere 15,000 units. The various half-tracks and specialized vehicles, each excellent in its specific role, were produced in quantities that seemed almost artisanal, handmade, compared to the overwhelming scale of American mass production. The mathematics of modern warfare had shifted decisively. Mass production of reliable, adaptable equipment had overwhelmingly trumped limited production of sophisticated, specialized machines. But the story went deeper than mere numbers. It delved into competing philosophies. German production philosophy emphasized excellence over quantity. Each vehicle was built to incredibly high standards with meticulous attention to detail, designed to be the best of its kind. American production philosophy, by contrast, emphasized adequacy at scale. Each vehicle was built to be good enough, rugged, reliable, and easily maintainable, with careful attention to simplicity and robustness. One philosophy produced vehicles that were individually superior, almost works of art. The other produced vehicles that were collectively overwhelming, a tide that could not be stemmed. In the brutal arithmetic of total war, collective capability, resilience, and ubiquity mattered infinitely more than individual excellence or specialized perfection. The German approach might win battles, dazzling with its precision. The American approach, however, would win wars, grinding down the enemy with sheer, relentless practical force. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945 across Europe, the vehicles didn't stop. They didn't retreat. They didn't stand down. Across occupied Germany, they carried food to starving civilians, a symbol of hope rather than conquest. They transported displaced persons to collection points, helping to piece shattered lives back together. They delivered vital medical supplies to overwhelmed hospitals. The same vehicles that had carried ammunition now carried hope. The transition from war to peace happened with astonishing speed, a testament to their inherent versatility. One day carrying ammunition, the next carrying food. One day mounting machine guns, the next mounting loudspeakers for public announcements, broadcasting directives and news. The very versatility that had made them such potent weapons of war now made them indispensable tools of peace and reconstruction. In the Pacific, where the war continued until August, they island-hopped with Marines, bounced through Philippine jungles, and eventually rolled through the streets of occupied Japanese cities. The Japanese, who had meticulously studied German tactics and equipment, found themselves facing the same mobile, relentless enemy that had overwhelmed their European allies. Japanese officers, who had initially dismissed American military capability as soft and lacking spirit, found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by forces that moved faster and more flexibly than their planning could accommodate. The brutal island campaigns, with their difficult terrain, dense jungles, and limited infrastructure, proved ideal for vehicles that could operate literally anywhere. They could be lifted over obstacles, carried on small landing craft, even airdropped to isolated units. Their fundamental simplicity meant they could be maintained in jungle conditions that would have rapidly destroyed more complex, finicky vehicles. Even in defeat, Japanese officers expressed amazement at American motorization. One Japanese general reportedly said these vehicles represented everything Japan had failed to understand about American industrial capacity and its underlying philosophy. Japan had prepared for a war of spirit and sacrifice. America had brought a war of steel and gasoline, of pragmatic, overwhelming force. The vehicles, more than any other single piece of equipment, symbolized the vast, insurmountable gulf between Japanese expectations and American reality. Where Japanese soldiers marched with legendary endurance, Americans rode with casual, efficient purpose. The contrast was demoralizing for Japanese forces and profoundly liberating for Allied prisoners of war who saw rescue arrive swiftly and powerfully on four wheels. But the real enduring legacy of these vehicles emerged not just in their wartime service, but in the subsequent decades of peace. Soldiers returning home from the war brought with them vivid, often cherished stories of the machines that had carried them through the conflict, saving their lives countless times. Many bought surplus versions, creating a thriving civilian market that continues in various forms to this very day. The vehicles that had been tools of war seamlessly became tools of peace and progress. Farmers used them in fields where their lightweight design prevented soil compaction, a distinct advantage over heavier tractors. ranchers used them to tend livestock across vast, rugged distances. Construction crews deployed them on job sites where their agility and four-wheel drive proved invaluable in navigating rough terrain. The design that had been born of military necessity, of impossible constraints, proved equally valuable, equally indispensable in civilian life, a testament to its fundamental soundness and versatility. In Europe, thousands remained, sold to governments desperate to rebuild from the devastation. French farmers used them to restore agriculture to war-torn fields. British agencies used them for rural mail delivery, navigating roads that were still damaged and broken. Even in Germany, former Wehrmacht soldiers found themselves, with a profound, bitter irony, driving American vehicles they had once targeted with their anti-tank guns. Whatever their origin, these vehicles worked, and work, efficient, reliable work, was what truly mattered in rebuilding a shattered continent. The design profoundly influenced military thinking worldwide for decades to come. Soviet forces, deeply impressed by their Lend-Lease vehicles, developed their own versions. The Gaz-67, while not a direct copy, clearly incorporated lessons learned from the American approach. British forces redesigned their vehicle doctrine around similar principles, abandoning overly specialized vehicles for more versatile generalist designs. The iconic Land Rover, developed in the late 1940s, drew undeniable inspiration from the American approach of simplicity, robustness, and versatility, adapting it to British needs. Even former enemies adopted the core concept. The German Bundeswehr, when rebuilt in the 1950s, emphasized simple, reliable vehicles over complex engineering. The Auto Union Munga, their military vehicle of the 1950s, showed clear influence from this pragmatic American design philosophy. Perhaps most importantly, these vehicles fundamentally changed how military planners thought about war itself. Future conflicts, the lessons clearly demonstrated, would be won not by individual superior weapons or by exquisite specialized machines, but by systematic advantages in logistics, communication, and above all, mobility. The ability to produce, deploy, and sustain equipment in overwhelming numbers in every conceivable condition mattered more than the equipment's individual specifications or theoretical capabilities. The revolution in military affairs that began with German Blitzkrieg was completed and ultimately overwhelmed by American mass motorization and its associated logistics. War was no longer about heroic charges or brilliant singular maneuvers alone. It was about sustainable mobility, reliable logistics, and industrial capacity applied at scale. The romantic vision of warfare, already gravely damaged by the brutal industrialized slaughter of World War I, died completely, definitively, in World War II. Soldiers who had served came to understand this intuitively, deeply. They had won not because their vehicles were inherently better than German tanks or half-tracks. They clearly weren't in any individual one-to-one comparison. They had won because they had vehicles when and where they were needed, in numbers that made individual comparisons utterly irrelevant. They had won because American industry had provided tools that worked consistently and reliably in every condition and circumstance, tools that could be fixed, adapted, and replaced without pause. The lesson was profound and lasting. In war, as in many endeavors, the perfect is indeed the enemy of the good. It is far better to have something that works robustly and reliably everywhere, that is available in abundance, than something that theoretically excels in nowhere but ideal, controlled conditions, or is available only in limited, fragile quantities. The German generals who had laughed in 1940 lived to see their entire conception of warfare overturned, demolished by a flood of practical, resilient simplicity. Those who survived the war and later wrote their memoirs often mentioned the profound shock of realizing how badly, how completely, they had misjudged American capabilities. Field Marshal Kesselring, a highly respected German commander, wrote that he had expected American forces to be well equipped, but was utterly unprepared for the material avalanche that descended on German forces. His memoirs reveal a professional soldier's grudging admiration for an approach he had initially despised. The Americans had not tried to match German excellence. They had simply buried it under an overwhelming, relentless quantity of effective adequacy. General Guderian, the brilliant architect of Blitzkrieg warfare, admitted with rare candor that German planning had utterly failed to account for American production capacity and the tactical flexibility it provided. His revolutionary tactics had assumed that mobile forces would always be elite, limited in number, carefully husbanded and deployed. The American approach of making every unit mobile, of democratizing mobility, had simply never occurred to German planners. They had thought in terms of specialized excellence, of precision instruments. Americans had delivered universal adequacy, robust and relentless. In the end, universal adequacy proved more revolutionary, more decisive, and ultimately more devastating than specialized excellence. But perhaps the most telling response, the one that cuts to the heart of the matter, came from the ordinary soldiers who had faced the relentless tide of American motorization. A captured German sergeant, interviewed after the war, articulated what had demoralized him most. It wasn't American firepower or sheer numbers. It was the mobility. "We would march 20 kilometers and be exhausted," he said, with a weary resignation. "They would drive 100 and be fresh, ready to fight. We knew the war was lost when we realized we were fighting the past against the future." His words captured a fundamental truth, a clash of eras. These vehicles represented more than military capability. They represented industrial modernity, defeating agricultural tradition, democratic mass production defeating authoritarian craftsmanship. Asked years later what single symbol best represented American victory in World War II, another German veteran, after a moment of thoughtful silence, didn't mention tanks or planes or battleships. He mentioned these vehicles. "They were everywhere," he recounted, his voice filled with a lingering sense of awe. "In combat, bringing supplies, evacuating wounded, carrying orders. You could destroy them, and it didn't matter, because more appeared. They were like a force of nature." He paused, then added with bitter, haunting humor, "We laughed at them in 1940. By 1945, they were carrying our surrender documents." The circle from mockery to utter defeat was complete. The story of this humble yet revolutionary vehicle resonates far beyond its historical moment, because it speaks to timeless truths about innovation, the profound dangers of arrogance, and the surprising power of humility. The German generals who laughed in 1940 embodied more than just a military miscalculation. They represented a mindset that confused complexity with capability, sophistication with superiority. They had built a military machine meticulously optimized for a specific type of warfare, and they simply couldn't imagine that simplicity, rugged practicality, and sheer scale might triumph over their refined, complex, and specialized perfection. In their laughter, in that moment of confident derision, was planted the undeniable seed of their ultimate defeat. They saw American pragmatism as a weakness, mass production as inherently inferior to meticulous craftsmanship, and simplicity as outright stupidity. They utterly failed to grasp that in war, as in many complex endeavors, the elegant, practical solution often beats the theoretically perfect one. They underestimated that quantity, when intelligently and reliably applied, has a quality all its own. They didn't understand that versatility, the ability to adapt to myriad unforeseen challenges, always trumps narrow specialization when the battlefield, or indeed any competitive arena, refuses to follow predetermined ideal patterns. The vehicles themselves became potent symbols of these competing philosophies. German designs pursued engineering excellence, creating machines that were individually superior in their specific function, but collectively insufficient to win a total war. American designs pursued practical solutions, creating machines that were individually adequate, robust, and versatile, but collectively overwhelming, unstoppable. One approach built monuments to engineering prowess. The other built tools for winning. One philosophy saw war as a test of excellence, a contest of precision. The other saw it as a problem to be solved, a challenge to be overcome by any effective means necessary. In the end, problem-solving decisively defeated excellence testing. Modern military thinkers still study this profound contrast. In an age of increasingly complex and astronomically expensive weapon systems, the lesson remains acutely relevant. The most sophisticated weapon, the most technologically advanced system, means absolutely nothing if it can't be produced in sufficient numbers, if it can't be maintained under brutal field conditions, or if it can't be adapted quickly to unexpected uses and unforeseen threats. The inherent danger of pursuing perfection, of hyper-specialization, at the expense of practicality, resilience, and adaptability remains a constant challenge. Current debates about military procurement, about which systems to fund, often echo these very same themes. Should we build a few incredibly excellent, incredibly expensive systems, or many adequate, robust, and versatile ones? Should we pursue revolutionary, cutting-edge capability, or evolutionary, proven reliability and mass availability? The answer, history suggests, depends on whether you want to win a few isolated battles or an entire war. Innovation, in every field, continues to face these same challenges, these same moments of potentially fatal misjudgment. Disruptive technologies often appear laughable, crude, or impractical to established experts in their field. The simple solution seems inherently inferior to the complex one. The practical appears crude next to the sophisticated. Yet history shows repeatedly and unequivocally that the experts who laugh first often find themselves crying last. The personal computer, in its infancy, seemed like a toy to powerful mainframe manufacturers. The Internet, when it first emerged from academic obscurity, seemed like a fleeting fad to traditional media empires. Digital cameras, with their grainy images, seemed laughably inferior to the rich quality of film photography. In each and every case, simplicity, accessibility, and versatility ultimately defeated complexity, exclusivity, and brittle excellence. The pattern repeats because human nature, with its inherent biases and rigidities, remains constant. We admire sophistication and often mistakenly conflate it with superiority. We value craftsmanship and instinctively assume it must defeat mass production. We respect expertise and, in our reverence, believe it trumps disruptive innovation. Today's parallels are numerous, striking, and often unsettling. Military planners who dismiss drones as mere toys echo the German generals dismissing American vehicles. Technology executives who mock simpler, more accessible competitors repeat patterns of arrogance that have doomed countless enterprises. The enduring tendency to conflate complexity with true capability remains a persistent human failing, a cognitive trap we continually fall into. We see it in business leaders who dismiss disruptive technologies as niche or unsophisticated. We see it in experts who mock simple, elegant solutions to complex problems, clinging to their elaborate, often inefficient methodologies. We see it in established players who laugh at new entrants, failing to recognize the seeds of their own obsolescence. That laughter often sounds confident, assured, but history, with its relentless hindsight, suggests it should sound nervous, filled with an underlying trepidation. The vehicles that rolled across Europe relentlessly everywhere represented more than just American industrial might. They embodied a profound philosophy that valued results over appearances, function over form, adaptability over theoretical perfection. They proved definitively that innovation doesn't always mean adding complexity, piling on features, or chasing the bleeding edge of technology. Sometimes, the most powerful innovation means finding the simplest solution that works, and then making it work everywhere, for everyone, without fail. They demonstrated that democratizing technology, making it accessible and usable by the masses, often matters infinitely more than perfecting it for a select few. That in competition, whether military, commercial, or even personal, accessibility, resilience, and ubiquity often trump exclusivity, fragility, and specialized perfection. For those who study military history, the story offers clear, unambiguous lessons. Never underestimate an enemy's industrial capacity, their ability to scale. Never dismiss simple, robust solutions merely because they lack superficial sophistication. Never assume that your definition of superiority perfectly matches the brutal, unpredictable reality of the battlefield. And most importantly, never let arrogance or intellectual rigidity blind you to emerging threats or unconventional approaches. Never forget that wars are won not by the best weapons in a theoretical vacuum, but by the most effective ones in a real-world context. Effectiveness, it turns out, is a complex equation that includes not just raw capability, but also availability, reliability, maintainability, and adaptability. The German focus on capability alone, their pursuit of brittle perfection, proved fatally narrow. For broader audiences, for anyone navigating the complexities of modern life, business, or technology, the lessons extend far beyond military applications. The solution that seems too simple, too obvious, might just be genius in disguise. The competitor who appears inferior might be playing a fundamentally different game entirely, a game you haven't even conceived of. The innovation that provokes laughter, that seems crude or unsophisticated, might be the very one that changes everything. Success in so many domains often comes not from doing one thing perfectly, but from doing many things adequately, reliably, and consistently. Not from excelling solely in ideal, controlled conditions, but from functioning robustly in all conditions, especially the chaotic and unpredictable ones. Not from impressing a panel of experts, but from empowering and serving a vast, diverse array of users. The German generals who laughed in 1940 could never have imagined that their mocking would echo through history as one of its most enduring, most poignant cautionary tales. They looked at American vehicles and saw weakness where they should have recognized strength. They meticulously counted specifications, comparing features when they should have been counting production capacity, assessing logistical resilience. They measured armor thickness, a symbol of brute strength, when they should have been measuring adaptability, a testament to intelligent design. Their laughter, in that decisive moment, revealed not American weakness, but German blindness. They were so focused on their own rigidly defined concept of excellence, their own narrow definition of what constituted a proper weapon of war, that they simply couldn't recognize a different, more powerful form of superiority. They were like master swordsmen, elegant and refined, mocking firearms as crude and inelegant, not realizing that the crude and inelegant would ultimately, inevitably, defeat the refined and sophisticated. Their laughter died a slow, agonizing death as millions of American vehicles rolled toward them, carrying not just soldiers and supplies, but the undeniable, unstoppable future of warfare. Each vehicle, as they had initially observed, was individually insignificant in comparison to their panzers, but collectively, they represented something the German military mind, with its adherence to hierarchical order and specialized function, simply couldn't grasp. The overwhelming, transformative power of simple, robust solutions applied at an unprecedented, relentless scale. They were democracy made steel, capitalism made mobile, pragmatism made victorious. They carried more than men and supplies. They carried a fundamentally different way of thinking about problems, a philosophy that would come to define the American century. The final irony, a twist of historical fate, is that the very vehicles they mocked outlasted not just the Third Reich, but the entire era of conventional industrialized warfare they, the Germans, had helped to invent. Long after the last Tiger tank was scrapped for its metal, long after the great panzers were rusting hulks in museums, these basic, resilient machines, modified and improved but fundamentally unchanged in their core design principles, continued serving worldwide. Their descendants still serve in conflicts around the globe, traversing deserts, jungles, and mountains, enduring testament to the fact that effective, adaptable design transcends its era, its specific conflict, and its initial perceived limitations. In museums today, visitors often walk past displayed versions without much recognition or fanfare. They seem unremarkable next to massive, gleaming tanks and sophisticated aircraft. Yet these modest machines transformed warfare more profoundly, more universally, than many of the spectacular, specialized weapons that draw the largest crowds. They deserve recognition not just for what they were, but for what they profoundly represented and against all odds accomplished. The story ends where it began, with laughter. But now, that laughter carries the immense weight of historical understanding, a somber echo through the decades. The German generals who dismissed American innovation in 1940 became unwitting, tragic teachers of a timeless lesson. Those who mock change, who refuse to adapt, often find themselves overwhelmed by it. They had mastered yesterday's warfare while Americans, with their pragmatic ingenuity, were building tomorrow's. Their initial amusement transformed into a searing, cautionary tale about the inherent dangers of underestimating practical innovation, of misjudging the power of simplicity, and of clinging to outdated notions of superiority. Their laughter echoes still, not as mockery, but as a stark, enduring warning. It reminds us that confidence can so easily become blindness, that expertise can so dangerously become dogma, that strength can so subtly become rigidity. Wars, and indeed any great competition, are not always won by the most sophisticated weapons or the most elegant designs, but by those who truly understand that effectiveness, robust, reliable, adaptable effectiveness, matters infinitely more than mere impressiveness. The vehicles that rolled across Europe proved that quantity, intelligently applied and endlessly sustained, could decisively defeat quality narrowly focused. They demonstrated that in conflict, as in progress, the last laugh belongs not to those who mock innovation, but to those who bravely, pragmatically embrace it. They showed that sometimes the future arrives not with fanfare and thunder, not with a roar of overwhelming power, but with the modest, persistent sound of a simple engine carrying profound, world-changing revolution on four small, unassuming wheels. The German generals learned too late that when change comes in humble, unexpected forms, the wise response is not laughter, but profound, focused attention. For in that very humility often lies the unstoppable seed of revolution itself,